I wanted to do a review of arrays and array lists to help you prepare for the Chapter 7 assessment. And one of the things that you'll see on the AP exam, and one of the things that people get caught up in, is the wording of questions having to do with arrays and array lists. So here's pretty much a similar type of question that you'll see on the AP exam. You're given an array named mystery, and then they have this kind of nebulous statement here that says, assume n represents an integer value that can be used to represent or hold the number of items or elements in the array. Now that statement right there is not meant to be tricky. All they're telling you is that you're dealing with an array, so immediately you should be thinking, length is going to tell me how many items are in the array, it's going to have a fixed size, etc. They're not telling you whether it's strings or ints or doubles or booleans, because that is irrelevant. Doesn't matter. You don't need to know that to answer the question they're going to ask you. So you know you've got an array, you know what it's named, and people get really confused with this statement about assume n represents an integer value that can be used to hold the number of items or elements. What they're telling you is n is basically holding the total number of elements in the array. It's an integer because we don't have 1.5 items in an array. We have 1 item or 2 items or 3 items. So the value that comes back when you get the length of an array is an integer, and they're going to use the variable or the letter n to represent the total count or number of items in the array. That's all that's saying. They're not trying to trick you with that part of the question. Then they say, okay, now given that you're dealing with an array and given that you can use the letter n to represent the number of elements in that array, which of the 4 options below would give you the total number of elements, the total count, the length in that array? Well, n, they're telling us n's an integer that's going to hold or represent the number of items in the array. So if that's the case, then if the array has 10 elements and n is going to be 10, n tells me how many items are in the array. So it doesn't matter how many are in the array, it's just that you understand they're giving you an integer variable more or less, and they're telling you this can be used to hold the total count of the array. So therefore, based on what they've told me, if there are 10 items in there, I would expect somewhere along the line n has been set to 10. N is representing the total number of elements no matter how many they are. So one correct answer to this question is n. They're trying to trick you here. They're trying to see if you really understand the difference between I have 10 items versus the last index number is 9, 10 minus 1, because I started counting with 0. That's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to say, do you understand that n minus 1 gives me the highest index number? If I have 10 elements, it's going to be 9. But that's not how many items I have. I have 10 items. So n minus 1 is not correct. N is. N would be 10 in this case. This would be 9, 0 to 9, representing the last index number. So that's incorrect. That's where they're trying to trick you with that whole minus 1 thing, to see if you get that offset for the last index number. Now mystery dot length, yes, if I take the array name and put dot length after it, I will get back the total count. In this case, I would get back a 10. If I have 10 items, I'm going to get back a 10 if I do mystery dot length. So I have 2 good answers to this. N, which is going to hold the total number of items, and mystery dot length, which would also, I could put it in a print line, do whatever I want to do, but it's going to give me back the total number of items. And here's where they're trying to trick you again with that whole length minus 1, and that is not valid. That would give me back, in this case, a 9, which would be great if I wanted to know the highest index number. But that's not what I want. I want to know the total number of items, which is 10. So don't get caught up in this trying to be tricky here. That's not the tricky part. The tricky part is where they're trying to throw you off and have you go, wait, I remember doing -1. Where did I do that? They're trying to trick you with the -1s, not with the letter N, or with the fact that they're not telling you anything else about the array. Another question you might see on an AP exam, something that you need to be aware of, is they might set up an array in this format. Remember, if you use the braces and you put the values in, you do not have to put anywhere the actual number of items. Java will figure out that the length or the count is 4. I have 4 candies identified: gumdrops, gummy bears, licorice, and nerds. So you're not sticking the number 4 anywhere when you do it this way. The compiler counts and knows that is the length. So they're going to have you look at several lines of code and tell them if the line of code is good or if it would cause an error. And one thing they'll try to do is trick you and see if you remember that you start counting with 0 and not 1. So they'll ask you what would print out if I did candy bracket 1 bracket, and they're trying to trick you into saying, oh, well, the first item is gumdrops, which that's true, but the 1 represents the second element, remember, because we start counting with 0. So gummy bears prints out when we use an index value of 1. The first item is always at index 0, so that would be gumdrops. And then they're really trying to trick you here, because they're trying to see if you know the difference between the count and the fact that the last item, because we started counting with 0, has an index of length -1. Okay, so trying to get you to prove to them you know the difference between the length and the last index number. So in this case, the last index number is 3, because this is 0, 1, 2, 3. Now that's 4 total items, but it's only 3 when you go 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so if you try to put a 4 here, you're going to get an array index out of bounds error, because that implies that there are actually 5 elements in the array: 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 index values. That's 5 items. So we know that the length is 4, the highest index value is 4 minus 1, or 3. So we've got 0, 1, 2, 3. Now we're fine, and that would print out nerds. Another thing to keep in mind, I'm not going to actually type it up here, but you cannot just throw away the information you learned from other chapters. You still need to remember what the mod operator does, and remember that gives you the remainder back and is used 99% of the time to figure out if a number is odd or even. So we'll take some number, %2, and if we get back a 0, we know the number's even. If we get back anything else, the number must be odd. And so you can't forget that. You'll have some code maybe that's using an array, and you're trying to figure out where the midpoint of the array is. So you might divide the length of the array by 2 to try to figure out which item, which index number is the midpoint of the array. So if I have 4 items in an array, I kind of have a problem, because there's no, the midpoint is really not easy to find, right? I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I divide 4 by 2, I get a remainder of 0. I have an even number of things. So if I want to get the middle value from that array, I might add the 2 middle items in the array, divide them by 2, and that's kind of my midpoint if the array is in numerical order. But if I have 5 items in an array, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, I might go to that index number 2, right? And that's my midpoint. So say that I had an array where I had 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Those are the numbers that are in it. And they're at position 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I'm trying to find the midpoint of this array, assuming again it's in numerical order. I'm going to get 3. You can see that visually, but if you had to do it mathematically, you would say, okay, I have 5 items, divide that by 2, my remainder is 1. Okay, that means I've got an odd number, so I can figure out where my midpoint is. So just be aware, you may see an array and you may be trying to find, okay, which of these elements numbered from 0 to 4 is the middle, and you might need to use the mod operator to figure that out. Another thing that you need to remember is when you're using random numbers, because you may see code that is using random numbers to populate an array, or you might see code that's using a random number generator to set the size of an array. But remember, if I have my next int, whatever number I put in here, I'm going to get random numbers in the range from 0 to that number minus 1. Okay, so if I have next int 4, the random numbers I'm going to get are going to be 0, 1, 2, and 3. I will never get a 4 out of this statement. It's always going to be numbers from 0 to whatever this number is minus 1. So if I put 100 here, I'm going to get random numbers in the range from 0 to 99. I'm never going to get the number 100. So just remember that when you're looking at the code. Now you also need to have the ability to answer some general questions on arrays and array lists. For example, you need to remember an array cannot be dynamically resized. Once you set the size in the code, that's it. If you allocate an array to hold 100 integers and you only use the first 5 spots in the array, that's fine, but those other 95 slots are still there. They're still eating up memory. They've just defaulted to 0. Okay? You can't say, well, I really only need it to be 5 without stopping the compiler, going into your code, erasing the number 100, putting a 5 in. Okay, that's the only way to do that for an array. Whereas with an array list, we can dynamically size it. If we allocate 100 units of memory, and as the program's running, realize that we need to delete or remove 95 of them, we can do that. And we can free that memory up and only use 5 values, 5 memory slots. So keep that in mind. You can dynamically size an array, array list rather. You cannot do that with an array. It is fixed. Once you declare it to be a certain size, that's it. Remember that with an array you can use primitive data types like int, boolean with a lowercase b, and double with a lowercase d. However, you cannot use those with an array list. You have to use the wrapper classes, integer with a capital I all spelled out, double with a capital D, and boolean with a capital B. And of course you can use strings with either one. And the reason for that is array lists do not take numbers, they take objects. And those wrapper classes convert numbers to objects, and we call that auto boxing. In effect, that takes place automatically when I set an array list up to hold integers and then I populate it with add paren 1 paren, add paren 100 paren. Auto boxing takes that primitive 1, that number I've entered, converts it to that wrapper class integer and turns it into an object which can then be stored in an array list. So those are the types of things that you'll have to answer questions on the test. I'm also going to do a part 2 recording for the review, but this will get you started.